But without further ado, it's time for our main topic. And the main topic this week is what you need to know about the SEC and its potential accredited investor definition change. And so last week, the SEC dropped a bombshell on everyone in the financial industries by announcing a newly proposed change to the vaunted accredited investor definition. And this is something that we've been talking about for a while. Everyone in security tokens has been talking for a while, but this affects not just security tokens, but many different industries and subsets of finance. And so as a reminder, the accredited investor is defined as a natural person, so an investor or a person who has an income of $200,000 across 2 years just 2 years in a row, and a reasonable expectation to continue earning at least that, or $300,000 if you're conjoining with your spouse. Or if you aren't necessarily making income, if you have a net worth of more than $1 million, that does not include your primary home or residence, which is what most Americans have their wealth tied to. But if you have $1 million on top of your primary residence, that also means you're an accredited investor. And as of 2016, estimates put that number of individuals that qualify for an investor or an accredited investor to be around 12 million Americans, or roughly 10% of all households in America. And so the report suggested a pool of about 125 million U.S. households. And so according to SEC Chairman Jay Clayton in the recent press release, he said, quote, "The current test for individual accredited investor status takes a binary approach to who does and who does not qualify based only on a person's income or net worth. Modernization of this approach is long overdue. The proposal would add additional means for individuals to qualify to participate in our private capital markets based on established, clear measures of financial sophistication. I am also pleased that the proposal specifically recognizes that certain organizations, such as tribal governments, should not be restricted from participating in our private capital markets." And this is an awesome quote. If you remember from some of the earliest episodes of the STO show, Herwig and I conducted a large draft and submitted a ton of feedback to the SEC regarding investor accreditation rules and many other private security exemption regulations and how those things can be improved. And we certainly were not the only ones. So many different people have acknowledged the fact that deciding whether somebody can invest in a private security only based off of how much money they have to lose seems relatively antiquated and not just. It doesn't seem right. There should be ways to prove your financial sophistication to allow you to invest in these things without necessarily requiring you to have a certain amount of money. The money factor might be a nice way to just kind of blanket treatment everybody, but at some point, a lot of people feel that it should be expanded to at least some level of sophistication, that if you are deemed to be smart enough or qualified intellectually in some way, that should be enough to allow you to invest as well. And many people have suggested that the fact that there's only opportunities for the wealthy to make these investments actually kind of furthers that class divide and hurts the wealth distribution in America, because there's no way for somebody to prove that they are capable of making proper investments. And so it's exciting. And so let's dig into some of these proposed inclusions or changes. Now, I will have to note that they are pretty general, and does not specifically include everything that likely will move forward with this, and they are not very specific about many of these things. But we've got a couple bullet points of important things to talk about. The first one being that a person with a certain professional certification and designation, including a Series 7, 65, or 82 license, as well as other credentials issued by an accredited educational institution, should be accredited investors. And so in this one, it's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of, Series 7 or 65 or 82 are investment banker licenses. There's other, credentials from an accredited educational institution, which we're not exactly sure what that could include, but suggestions might be maybe if you are a doctor, or if you pass the bar, or if you've got some kind of higher level graduate degree, things like that could potentially, a PhD, maybe are credentials that would be included in here that, again, suggests that you've got some level of higher education and are capable of making your own investment decisions regardless of how much money you necessarily have. Moving on, the second one is a, quote, knowledgeable employee of a fund with respect to investments in a private fund. And so I interpreted this as potentially people that are working on deals day in and day out, that understand the terms of private deals and private investments, that certainly show that they are qualified because they're the ones that are managing these funds for institutions. If you're qualified to manage these funds for institutions, maybe that you should be qualified to make those investments on your personal behalf as well. But again, that one's maybe up to more interpretation. Herwig, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to give some examples, maybe such as a financial analyst or someone who is doing the financial structuring of deals and the like. I think individuals like that, even the managing director themselves, they can invest as the entity, but they can't invest themselves potentially as accredited investors unless they qualify under the original definition.
Right, exactly. So if you're working closely in a fund or alongside deals, the SEC is suggesting that you may be qualified and should be qualified to make your own personal investment definitions.
You can be a managing director of a private fund, 10, 20, 50, $100 million. But if you yourself do not make more than $200,000 a year or have $1 million in net worth, you as an individual are not an accredited investor. The goal of exactly the wording here is to change that.
It's actually pretty relevant. One of the commissioners that voted in favor of expanding this definition, I believe it was Roisman, but I'm not exactly sure. One of them did specifically note that they themselves were not an accredited investor based off of the current regulation, which should not make very much sense. If you're a commissioner of the SEC, you'd think that person would have qualified to be able to make private investments. But again, solely according to the assets themselves, one of the main deciding commissioners is himself not even qualified to make these investment decisions. So exactly to their point. And then finally, the third one that we found notable to discuss was limited liability companies, registered investment advisors, and rural business investment companies, provided that they meet certain criteria that still need to be properly defined. And so, again, registered investment advisor is a license that you can get. You'd think if you were a registered investment advisor, you probably have the capacity to advise yourself on your own investments,
you would
right?
think, Kyle.
So again, they need to specify and include more of what these criteria that need to be defined, really explore those in more detail. But I love where their head's at here because there really should be some level of sophistication that you could prove in different ways that don't necessarily need a new test. And you don't need an accredited investor test. But if you're a registered investment advisor, you'd think that should mean that if you're approved to do that and manage other people's funds, you should be qualified to manage your own as well. So I love where the SEC is headed here. Of the 5 commissioners that vote on these changes, 3 voted in favor, 2 voted against. The 3 in favor were the Republican commissioners Clayton, which is the chairman, as well as Pierce and Roisman. And the 2 Democratic commissioners, Jackson and Lee, voted in opposition, citing that the purported rule changes were, quote, overly inclusive. So it seems that the majority rules in this case, and the SEC is actually currently accepting feedback on these changes. So I have no doubt Herwig and I will put something together and submit our feedback as well. But
in fact, this change may be as a result of those who joined us in our feedback to the SEC's request to harmonize capital markets. Kyle and I led a campaign bringing together as many individuals who participate in private capital markets to support one of our suggestions, which was, of course, to expand the accredited investor definition. So regardless of whether it was us, there were many others who submitted feedback with very similar phrasing. And at the end of the day, this was something that has been on the radar for a long time, so it is exciting to see finally a change happen. We have to keep in mind that largely other than updating and accounting for inflation, the definition of accredited investors has not changed for roughly 80 years since it was first created. So why is all of this really so important, and why are we covering it on the show? Well, really, as a U.S. citizen, the primary way to participate in a private offering is through Reg D, which represents essentially 99% of all private placements. Unfortunately, in order to participate in these offerings, you need to be an accredited investor, which is why, as you pointed out, Kyle, many see this as a exclusive market for the wealthy, because literally the test to qualify is essentially defining you as wealthy, someone who is in the top 10% of Americans. Now, a law known as the Jobs Act was passed in 2012, which enabled more ways for non-accredited investors to participate in private offerings, but unfortunately their usage pales in comparison, with just a few hundred offerings combined over the last few years for these non-accredited offerings, compared to 35,000 plus Reg D offerings on a yearly basis. So you can imagine that still it is largely controlled by the Reg D markets. Mm-hmm. Now, the new definition would obviously enable a lot more people to qualify as accredited, and not to do so by some sort of a wealth test, but actually a more knowledge or experience-based test. It's estimated that there are roughly 600,000 FINRA members, that typically hold one of those licenses that can now qualify. There are roughly 32,000 private funds in the U.S. If on average 10 people working for those funds would now qualify, there's another 320,000 individuals. We're now starting to approach nearly 1 million more people that will now qualify. There's another 13,000 RRAs that would get added. And of course, the proposal doesn't specifically define what other accreditations or certifications should qualify and what an LLC needs to meet in order to qualify as well, which potentially could be several more million people that end up qualifying either as persons or entities in order to be accredited, which is, of course, a massive change. We're now talking north of 10 to 20% in additional people that now qualify, which for sure, if private markets are largely run by this investor class, naturally one would expect that the private capital markets will grow even more robust and efficient. And of course, this would also potentially have an impact on the public markets as a result. And therefore, I think that's why you're also seeing some pushback regarding the potential, inclusivity. If you start to go and say doctors now qualify, you're talking about tons and more people that perhaps some of those commissioners feel certain do not qualify to invest. Of course, we all recommend that you go to the SEC website and suggest your own feedback to them about who should qualify. This is certainly not something that we're going to decide or have any influence on directly. It needs to be heard from everybody in the space. And we also should go into why this is also very important for them to specifically clarify who qualifies as accredited investors. Specifically because STOs primarily use Reg D 506C, which allows your offering to be advertised and solicited, but in exchange requires that the issuer verify the accredited investor status of each participating investor. There are, of course, companies like InvestReady, which, by the way, I am a founder of, which started in 2013 to help provide accreditation software for issuers and platforms to meet this new SEC requirement as of 2013. And of course, because you need to be able to certify this, you need things like, a Series 7, which a license number can be checked on FINRA. If there is ambiguity in terms of how you could qualify, this could be leaving an open room or a loophole for people to abuse the law and qualify as accredited, which is something the SEC is specifically trying to avoid as they try to broaden the definition properly. So this is really a matter, I think, and I think it's even clear that the two commissioners who oppose it aren't necessarily opposed to expanding the definition. Right. It's just going to come down to specifically who now should qualify in what seems to be definitely a more new kind of test, a more experience or credentials-based test as opposed to just simply by net worth or income. Obviously, at the end of the day, the logic is pretty simple for the potential of this change. More investors qualifying means more investments and more value creation. More potential investors means a larger buyer pool, which potentially means, of course, more efficient private markets and potential chance for liquidity. So overall, Kyle, I'm very excited, not just for my own company, which will now potentially have a larger user base, but I'm excited for the industry and for private capital markets, which have been yearning for a change like this for decades now.
Absolutely. I think you summarized it perfectly. It's incredibly exciting. We're going to be opening it not only to more accredited investors, but I certainly am under the belief that these specific accredited investors likely are more active than your average accredited investor just across any industry, which I think is also great for capital markets. So even if it's only 1 million people, you're talking 1 million of maybe some of the most active accredited investors, which the impact on those markets could be much larger than even just the amount of accredited investors themselves. And as I've mentioned before, and as I'm sure you agree with me, I just think that this is right for fair capital markets to have the ability for those that are interested in private investments in making their, in participating in this space, to not be held back by solely these wealth locks that are currently
in fact,
in place.
In our suggestion that we gave to the SEC regarding harmonization, we even included non-accredited investors being able to qualify based on passing certain tests and the like. So I would say that Kyle and I are definitely more liberal and open-minded to when it comes to who should qualify. Of course, it's going to be the SEC that ultimately makes the changes. So again, we'll be sure to leave the link in the description.
One step at a time, feedback. Right? Exactly. Give us feedback. We'll let you know. We'll keep you updated as we prepare what we would like to say. And thank you again to everybody who participated in the last one. We had almost 50 people that co-signed it alongside with us, with many of the top industry leaders. We really appreciate that. And I'm pretty confident to say that we at least had some positive impact. Hopefully they read ours and many of the other submissions we saw from members of the community. And all of us together are working towards making better capital markets.
That's it, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and listening to this year's final episode. We'll be back next week in 2020 with predictions for the year. And of course, I'm Herwig Konings. I want to thank you all for listening.
Talk to you next year.